Greetings, two baristas. Well, this could be the headline in your local corporate media newspaper in the not-so-distant future. Yeah. How it could end is at this point mere speculation, but that it is on political life support is no longer in doubt. Congress has become a sort of ICU, brought into emergency code by its own self-inflicted cancer of corruption, heart disease from self-complacent obesity, and the life-endangering filth of its own unsanitary household management. The rulers of the U.S. and A have forgotten that the Western parliamentary tradition from which they came was founded on the political rise of the middle classes. It was made possible by the economic clout and demographics of a middle stratum that could buffer the social antagonism and servility between wealth and privilege above and poverty and despair below. That all could meet in a common house of the people, where no one was master or servant, but united to thrash out the great issues of humanity for the common good. Now we live in a culture that mocks and trashes the very concept of the common good, so the destruction of the common meeting place itself can't be far off. Just as the economic elites no longer wish to be bothered by the poor, refusing to see them as fellow citizens or even human, so do the political leaders bought by the privileged to protect the privileged come to see the people as a mere nuisance in the way of legislation and sound policy. This inner vacuity is a direct affront to the natural order of things, for as we're told in high school science, nature abhors a vacuum. Since there's no empty space allowed in nature, so it has to be filled with something. And that is lobbyists, the front men of the privileged, who keep so-called public figures on retainer like private attorneys, who in fact pay off the judges as well. All this is obvious and doesn't need me to say it. I need to emphasize why this is going to destroy the American and European political order as you've known it. When you have a society so polarized that no middle stratum can develop, or is consciously under destruction as in North America and Europe, you create the instability of Russia and Germany of a century ago or of South Africa and Latin America today. The great revolutions of the past occurred not just because wealth and poverty, privilege and exclusion lived side by side, but when masses of people became convinced that their poverty was wrong and the privileged no more than criminals, when there was no political medium to channel discontent into constructive solutions, when the only way to begin such construction was first by destruction, sweeping the accumulation, the rot, generations out of the way into the dumpster of history. Could parliamentary democracy in the Western sense ever have taken hold in Russia 100 years ago? There were fundamental reasons why it was a doubtful project from the get-go. The Russian middle class was weak in numbers and in wealth, squeezed by an entrenched elite of landholders, capital holders, bureaucrats, and army officers who turned against the new order as soon as it threatened their property and status, and by the dark people in their villages and factory tenements, hungry for land and bread, for work and an end to senseless war that squandered their blood like deficit goods. With such a social divide, there was really little hope of a common meeting house where both sides could come together for a common good, because those above considered themselves masters and would not sit with those below on any terms of equity, while those below rightly saw that they could never become enfranchised citizens until the privileges of the master class were broken. This is why the Russian Democrats, nearly all middle-class reformers by Western standards, after the great national unity and pushing out the Tsar, diddled around rather than hold elections, afraid of civil war, hoping to exploit a foreign war as the great national unifier. Why they were overthrown first by the attempted putsch of a Pinochet-type figure, General Kornilov, commander-in-chief of the Russian army, trying to preserve what was left of property-based law and order, and then by Lenin's Bolsheviks applying the final blow in the name of Soviet power. And so the very civil war the Democrats so feared came upon them anyway, brought about by their own omissions as much as anyone else's commissions. Then there's Weimar Germany, between 1919 and 1933, whose every attempt at democracy was cursed, first by Democrats who allied with reactionaries to drown the left in blood, then by the traditional officers, aristocrats, bureaucrats, big business, cartels, and speculators in the gold standard, who destroyed the middle class by inflation to beat out their creditors, who turned the Reichstag into their private servant, culminating in the dismissal of that servant and hiring a new overseer whose name I surely don't have to repeat yet again. In South Africa, another small black middle class, the talented 10th in Booker T. Washington's phrase, was deliberately created after apartheid as a safety valve to avoid social revolution. As in Latin America, this fragment of society cannot really get off the ground due to entrenched privilege above and a clutching poverty-racked mass below, left to rot in its own misery and despair. Any time in Latin America the middle class seeks to ally itself with the poor majority and change the corrupted economic and political order, it meets repression, as in Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, and in Central America in the 80s. In South Africa, its parliamentary system clings to life, much as in the USA, kept afloat by outside transfusions of capital, while the forgotten 99% sink into permanent generational unemployment, epidemic terminal disease, and one of the worst crime rates on the planet. Only the living memory of the anti-apartheid struggle gives the new regime legitimacy. But as its memory fades and those leaders retire, a new generation of poor will see no reason to obey, and a new generation of leaders will see no reason to keep up the democratic pretense. So now we come back to the USA. The parallels with Russia, Germany, Latin America, and South Africa are coming closer to roost every passing year. The great fear is that the so-called slump, the Great Recession, will become a permanent depression, with no recovery possible because the wealthy and privileged, who created the crisis, control the government to shut off any possible solution for the common good, to turn the common meeting house into a whorehouse, just another address in the D.C. red light district. So, what to do? The Occupy movement certainly have the right idea. Over a century ago, there was Coxey's Army, a grand march on Washington of the unemployed, of which L. Frank Baum, author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, was involved, and in fact his book was a political parable disguised, as often is the case, as children's literature. The scarecrow symbolized the American farmer, the Tin Man the industrial worker, and the Cowardly Lion was William Jennings Bryan, who all march on the yellow brick road of the gold standard to Oz, the capital, or Washington, D.C., demanding relief from the wizard, that is, the president, the man behind the curtain revealed as a trickster and fraud. We won't go into who the Wicked Witch or Toto represented. Dorothy's shoes were made of silver in the book, by the way, not the movie's Technicolor ruby red, suggesting the use of free silver as the path of freedom from panic and dead ends like the Depression of 1893, the worst one yet before 1929. Well, Coxey's occupation movement had to contend with the real army of occupation, federal marshals and troops, who finally prevented them from reaching D.C. But they left behind a legacy of protest that was tried again in 1914, and again in 1932 with the Veterans Bonus March, and in Martin Luther King's March on Washington in 1963, all of which demonstrates that change originates outside of the system. The American labor movement and civil rights movement didn't just pressure elected leaders to do something, they got off their own asses and became the change they wanted to see, making followers of their so-called leaders, showing these leaders were not really leaders at all, but lackeys. The Occupy movement can become such a vehicle for change only if its disparate links can forge a structure that keeps its momentum going. To succeed, all revolutions must continue moving forward, gathering speed until their momentum becomes unstoppable by their opposition. Only the establishment that recognizes this power and opens the door in time survives. In a Western parliamentary system, the middle class is the social force that keeps the house from being torn apart by millions of angry hands from below or crushed by the mailed fist from above. Now, it's possible to have more direct forms of participating democracy that truly benefit the majority, not the libertarian kind of the biggest takes the bone. But there are concerted and well-funded efforts to destroy democracy of itself, regardless of form, as well as the economic well-being of the majority who needs it. Okay, another interruption. Hello, David Koch. What do you have to say about the American middle class? Just that it needs to be taught a lesson about living beyond its means? That austerity and belt-tightening are necessary for it to get its priorities right? Well, aside from you being the one to teach them such lessons, how can unemployment and foreclosure and untreated sickness and no school for the kids make for a better society? By purging the unfit into the dumpster of nature. And those left behind who survive this genocide will be only those who put themselves first and let the drowning sink. Because there's only winners and losers, the fit and the unfit, the saved and the damned. There is no middle. Time for the parliamentary state to go away too. After all, who needs a common meeting house at a graveyard?